Welcome to Forests, Folklore, and Fantasy. My name is Kelly, but I write and publish under my initials as K.M. Rice. Whoever you are and wherever you're listening from, I want you to know that you are most welcome here. This episode was recorded in the autumn of 2024 when I thought that I was restarting the podcast for its second season, planning on recording through that winter. But fate, it seems, had other plans because at the start of 2025, I discovered that I actually had cancer and spent most of that year going through treatment. I'm happy to say I'm back to feeling like my old self, as much as that's possible after such an experience. And the content of this episode, I think, is even more dear and near to my heart now than it was when I first recorded it. But I invite you now to take a few deep breaths, relax, and join me for an exploration on the power of story. 4 of the most compelling words in the English language are once upon a time. I'm going to begin with this short quote from the book Courting the Wild Twin by Martin Shaw. If you're unfamiliar with Dr. Shaw's work, he is a very well-respected folklorist and an absolutely brilliant oral storyteller. I have the book both in print and on audiobook, and I highly recommend both. But if you get the audiobook, it is read by the author, and he is just such a remarkably engaging orator that it's a treasure not to be missed. The business of stories is not enchantment. The business of stories is not escape. The business of stories is waking up. Like most things I truly love and return to again and again to savor their flavor, I don't truly understand the breadth and depth of that quote by Martin Shaw. And that's what keeps me coming back for more. I see stories as an expression of a universal need to attempt to understand ourselves, each other, and our world. As human beings, we seem to crave catharsis and release and a closure that we will never truly attain while we are alive. Humans have been searching for some definitive, encompassing concept of what it is to be a human, what it is to be alive, and the meaning of life. Since even before we were Homo sapiens. This yearning for some sort of closure, this yearning for some sort of complete understanding of ourselves and of our existence that can never be achieved is part of, ironically, our drive to create art. And storytelling is indeed a form of art. In case it isn't clear, the reason that we cannot have the closure that we so seek is because of death. We don't understand death. That's why religions exist. And many different religions will offer you an explanation of death, or perhaps rebirth, or perhaps just the death of this mortal body and the continuance of the consciousness or the soul in some way. But no matter what your belief system, that understanding, that tidy packaging of a life can only be understood from whatever lies on the other side. To quote Danish theologian and philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So if you oftentimes feel lost and alone and confused and directionless, know that that is the universal human condition and has been for time immemorial. Just a moment ago, I said that this yearning to experience and understand the world through art goes beyond our current species. And I want to quantify that by giving you more information. 500,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago, one of our ancestors, Homo erectus, engraved shells. Now, there's some debate over if this can be considered art or not. And also bear in mind that all of this information is based on the archaeological record, which means that there could have been a multitude of other examples from this era, previous eras more closer in time to the existence or emergence of our species that just have not survived or have not been discovered yet. We know that our closest relative, the Neanderthal, created art in what is now modern Germany. A 51,000-year-old carving was found, and that carving is a series of patterned straight lines on the bone of a giant deer that was incredibly rare in the area. So it's intuited that those bones were chosen for a very specific reason and had a potent symbology to those people. I am personally, I'm very comfortable referring to Neanderthal as people. Our ancestors experienced the same intense curiosity about existence as we do. Our presence here is a mystery. So is our departure. We only know our lived experience and our life experience unless we can hear from others, unless we can slide into the skin of another person and understand and experience the world from their point of view. And therein lies a wealth of vicarious knowledge. And the best way to do that is through story. Stories forge connections between people and ideas, landscapes and communities, and they carry with them the history and values of a culture or a specific region. Having a cultural identity is often a touchstone of security and understanding of oneself. Stories make us feel more secure in the world and less alone. A reminder that you may not need, but just to add some context, is that for 99.9, if not more, percent of human history, storytelling has been completely oral. Novels are still novel in the scheme of things, and cinema has barely even made a blip in the pages of time when it comes to storytelling. And what I find absolutely fascinating is the fact that, as you would suspect, given the prevalence of oral storytelling, it's reflected in our neurology. When we are engaged with a compelling story, when we are invested, our brains activate the regions associated with memory, along with emotion and empathy. Many of you have already likely experienced the phenomena of being able to remember a story more than you could remember any sort of facts. This is built into our wiring. Even more astounding to me, and this is something I only recently learned, we release oxytocin, the love hormone, when we are listening to a compelling story and we are engaged in that narrative. That oxytocin creates a bond of connection and trust. Personally, I don't really see this bond being formed with the individual telling the story, or the storyteller, or the words on the page, or the individuals on the screen, but rather the story itself. I want to be clear about oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hormone that facilitates the bonds between parents and infants. It's released when giving birth and breastfeeding. It is the hormone that facilitates the bond between lovers. And as a side note, we now have scientific evidence of something that all of us animal lovers have known for ages, which is that both humans and dogs release oxytocin when looking at each other, when you have a close bond. You know, they actually love us and we approve. Not that we needed it, but I thought that was a fun side note. But that oxytocin is promoting trust, as I said, but also recognition, attachment, and helps us regulate stress. When we are engaged with a compelling story, we are literally laying the foundations of a healthy human relationship. I'll say that again. We are laying the foundations of a healthy human relationship between us as an individual. Well, more on that later, are we? But between the listener and the story, a thing that does not actually have a physical presence. How is that not anything short of magic? Just as remarkable. When engaged with a compelling narrative, we exhibit something called neural coupling, which is essentially a fancy way of saying that our brain patterns sync with the storytellers and presumably with those of the other listeners, which is likely why it fuels the fullness and sense of connection and community and shared journey that we experience with strangers in an audience, the strangers sitting next to us in a darkened theater when we go see a film. This is referred to as communitas, which is the Latin word that roughly translates to unstructured community. the term communitas was popularized in 1969 by anthropologists Edith and Victor Turner. It essentially encompasses the concept of the equality of an experience, because in an audience, we are all equals. And losing ourselves in story, we shed our egos because we shed our identities and begin living through the experiences of that story. We enter into that fascinating state of liminality, which you have heard me talk about before because it's something I'm very fascinated by. It comes up again and again in folklore. And we enter into that state of liminality as a group. Liminality is basically an in-between place, or an in-between state of being. In Latin, a limen is a threshold. So if you think about a threshold, something we don't really ponder when we come in and out of our houses, you are going from this, I would argue, artificial concept of inside into the artificial concept of outside. But nevertheless, it is a concept that has lived with us for generations immemorial, going from our place of shelter and hopefully safety to the unknown. And that brief moment when you are crossing the threshold, you are neither inside the safety of your dwelling nor outside in the tumultuous unknown. You're in between. A liminal state is a state of ambiguity and disorientation. It's a dissolution of the rigid definitions, not only of self, but of society. And that is exactly what a good story gives us. It's something we all crave. To leave ourselves behind for a short while, in essence, to go on a little vacation away from ourselves, our troubles, our stresses, our identity, and experience life through someone else. I didn't put this in my notes as that I was compiling before I recorded this episode, but it's occurring to me right now that that's what a good dream does as well. And of course, that begs the question, do we dream because we are literally biologically wired for story? Or are we wired for story because we dream? Even before I ever was exposed to this concept of communitas, I am old enough to remember the days of getting an actual TV guide in the mail and being able to scan it, or in the newspaper, those things of the past newspapers, physical newspapers, and scan the TV guide to find a movie or TV show I wanted to watch. And joyous tingle I would feel knowing that other people were watching it with me. I may have been alone in front of the TV watching, what would it have been as a teenager? Probably Stargate SG-1 or The X-Files with my headphones on, because I had younger siblings and it would have maybe been inappropriate for them. But I remember, even though I was physically alone, feeling like I wasn't alone and experiencing it, and noticing that difference between popping in my VHS tape of Titanic and watching that versus watching it when it was airing on television, and knowing that somewhere else in the world, someone was also watching it with me. I don't know if that's a component of this neurobiology or if that's just a Kelly quirk, but I'd be interested to hear from you listeners if you've ever observed something similar in your own experience. Now, of course, all of this seeming universality likewise requires some exploration, and a man named Joseph Campbell did just that and proposed this idea of the monomyth. Many of you have likely already heard about or are somewhat familiar with the concept of the hero's journey, most famously utilized by George Lucas in his original Star Wars film. But the hero's journey was popularized by Joseph Campbell, who was very heavily influenced by the psychologist Carl Jung. I mentioned this idea of the monomyth. The monomyth is this concept that humanity inevitably is telling the same story again and again and again. In 1949, Joseph Campbell published a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And I'm going to read to you a brief quote from it that summarizes the concept of the hero's journey. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. In the simplest terms, the hero's journey, as often taught by screenwriters, is about a character who moves from their status quo and, I would argue, enters a state of liminality, in other words, change, has a multitude of experiences, ups and downs, and returns to whatever the status quo was and betters it. Or in the case of a tragedy, makes it worse, but alters it in some fashion. There are 17 specific stages that Campbell plots out as part of the hero's journey. Visually, it's often represented as a circle, as a cycle. And I'm just going to hit on the main points, but I'm not going to go into depth unpacking them. There's a lot of resources you can find online to do so if you get intrigued by this. But I feel like these motifs are going to sound familiar. This pattern, rather, is going to sound familiar. So it begins with the call to adventure and usually involves supernatural aid. And this is the point in which the character crosses the threshold from the known into the unknown, often with the aid of a guardian. Once they've crossed into the unknown, it's the beginning of their transformation. And they have helpers and or mentors, and they face challenges and temptations, and again, are aided by whoever their wisdom keeper is. They hit their lowest point, which can involve death and rebirth, at least in a symbolic form. It's an abyss, and they often emerge with a revelation that then facilitates a transformation. As they begin their journey back toward where they began, there's often a process of reconciliation or atonement. And then they recross the threshold from the unknown into the known. And at that point, there's often some form of a divine feminine presence, and they return to their community and to their home. Does it sound familiar? It should, because our most popular stories today, more or less, follow that pattern. It's no secret that we live in a patriarchy and have been living in patriarchies for a great many generations. At least the dominant societies and cultures have been patriarchies. I'm sure there's a lot of nuance there, but that goes beyond the scope of this episode. But suffice it to say that this model does hinge on the structure of a patriarchy. The heroes or protagonists or main characters are almost always male. And that's why there is some sort of encounter with the divine feminine at the end to almost bestow some form of blessing upon the male character that makes him whole. Now, that said, this concept of the monomyth, especially as presented by Joseph Campbell, has come under criticism. The most valid criticism that I've come upon is that he sort of picked and chose which stories to examine to create this concept of the hero's journey, and that he excluded myths and folktales that did not fit the mold. So, of course, that would be an in case of inductive reasoning rather than deductive reasoning, as I understand it, of just gathering evidence for your theory rather than having a theory and looking at the evidence, or even better, looking at the evidence and forming a theory. There are other criticisms that I won't get into, but it's also my understanding that in academia, there's always a conversation and an idea or a theorem may be put forth and then upheld for quite a while and either be challenged at the time that it's posited or challenged by subsequent scholars in the field, and rightly so. And that often someone is looking to make their stamp in their field of study by challenging something that has previously been established or putting something forth. And that's healthy. That's how it should be. We should always be having discussions and questioning. But in spite of the criticism, or rather, regardless of the criticism, you can't escape the fact that his influence and the influence of this story structure governs most tales, because at its heart, a story is always a character doing something and experiencing change. And we can learn vicariously from this character's journey, whether they triumph or fail. Re-listening to this episode as I prepare to edit and post it, I was also struck with the thought that the hero's journey also very much mimics the experience of the listener or the reader or the viewer, because we are taken from our status quo into a liminal realm where we experience things outside of our ordinary, outside of ourselves, outside of our lived experience, hopefully edified in some way, hopefully had a mirror held up to us in some way, hopefully uncovered something about ourselves or our world or our loved ones, and then we return to our status quo, hopefully changed. Who now can tell me Simba's journey in The Lion King? Who can share with me Frodo's story in The Lord of the Rings? Who can tell me of Odysseus's trials in the Odyssey? And what is the chemical equation for photosynthesis? In what year did World War I end? What is the Pythagorean theorem? You may not be able to answer those questions that most of us were expected to memorize in traditional education. But I am certain that if asked, you will be able to tell me your story. Thank you so very much, dear listener, for lending me the most valuable thing you have to offer, which is your time, by choosing to join me for this episode of Forests, Folklore, and Fantasy. Just as a reminder, you can keep up with me on my various social media accounts. And if you would like to, you are more than welcome to join me on Patreon. You can create a free account and upgrade if you feel so moved. My patrons are a boon to me, and their financial contributions are what keep my creative endeavors, such as this podcast, my YouTube series, Happy Hobbit, my writing, my crafting, they keep all of that going, or at least help in a very significant way. I am also excited to share that I now have a Discord server. It's called Wanderfolk, and there are several different channels there already, some of which foster creativity. This podcast has its own channel if you want to pop over and discuss an episode or two. And of course, it's a space for us to not only share what we're working on, but how we are walking the wheel of the year. So the link to that and everything else I've mentioned can be found in the show notes. The beautiful music you have heard in this episode was composed by Lane Thomas from his fantasy-themed album, The Lands Beyond. And you can find a link to that in the show notes. Thank you so very much once again. And until next we meet, may your hearth be warm and your heart be full.